Today, we're diving into the exciting world of phrasal verbs. These verb and preposition or adverb combinations can seem tricky at first, but they're a crucial part of mastering English. Phrasal verbs are used all the time in everyday conversation and writing, so learning them will help you communicate more naturally and effectively. As we explore phrasal verbs together, try to think of examples from your own conversations or things you've read. This will help you connect the new concepts to your existing knowledge and make them easier to remember. Let's start by defining what we mean by phrasal verbs. Part 1. What are phrasal verbs? A phrasal verb is a combination of a verb and a preposition or adverb, or sometimes both, that creates a new meaning. This new meaning is often quite different from what you would expect based on the original verb. Let's look at a few examples to make this clearer. I gave up smoking last year. Here, gave up means quit. She's looking after her sick grandmother. In this case, looking after means caring for. They've run out of milk. The phrasal verb run out of means used up the supply. As you can see, the phrasal verb takes on a new meaning that you might not guess just from looking at the individual words. Another important thing to know about phrasal verbs is that they can be transitive or intransitive. Transitive phrasal verbs require a direct object, while intransitive ones do not. Here are a couple of examples. I'll call off the meeting. This is transitive because the meeting is the direct object. The plane took off an hour late. Here, took off is intransitive since there's no direct object. Knowing whether a phrasal verb is transitive or intransitive will help you use it correctly in a sentence. We'll practice this more as we go along. Part 2. Common phrasal verbs and their meanings. Now, let's explore some of the most common phrasal verbs and their various meanings. As we go through these examples, try to think of a time when you've heard or seen the phrasal verb used in context. 1. Bring up. This can mean to raise a topic, like in the sentence, I didn't want to bring up the issue during dinner. It can also mean to raise children, as in, she was brought up in a small town. 2. Get over. Get over can mean to recover from something, like an illness. For example, it took me weeks to get over the flu. It can also mean to overcome a challenge or obstacle. He's trying to get over his fear of heights. 3. Give up. This often means to quit something, as in, I'm giving up sugar for a month. But it can also mean to surrender, like in the sentence, the thieves gave themselves up to the police. 4. Look after. Look after usually means to take care of someone or something. Who's looking after your dog while you're away? It can also mean to keep an eye on something temporarily, like in the sentence, can you look after my bag for a minute? These are just a few examples of common phrasal verbs, but they illustrate how a single phrasal verb can have multiple meanings. As you learn more phrasal verbs, try to pay attention to the context to figure out which meaning is being used. Let's move on to another aspect of phrasal verbs, separable and inseparable phrasal verbs. Part 3. Phrasal verbs can be separable or inseparable, and it's important to know the difference. Separable phrasal verbs allow the direct object to come between the verb and the preposition or adverb. Listen to these examples. I'll turn the lights off. Or, I'll turn off the lights. She handed the report in. Or, she handed in the report. In both cases, the direct object, the lights, or the report, can go before or after the preposition or adverb. On the other hand, inseparable phrasal verbs don't allow the direct object to come between the verb and preposition or adverb. Here are a couple of examples. We ran into some old friends at the mall. You wouldn't say, we ran some old friends into at the mall. I'm looking forward to the weekend. It would be incorrect to say, I'm looking the weekend forward to. Here's a tip. If the phrasal verb has a direct object and that object is a pronoun, it must go between the verb and the preposition or adverb. For instance, I'll turn them off. You wouldn't say, I'll turn off them. She handed it in. It would be wrong to say, she handed in it. By remembering this rule, you'll be able to use separable and inseparable phrasal verbs correctly in your own speech and writing. Part 4. Phrasal verbs with multiple particles. Some phrasal verbs can have more than one preposition or adverb, which can further modify their meaning. These are sometimes called phrasal prepositional verbs. Let's look at some examples. Look forward to means to anticipate with pleasure. Put up with means to tolerate. Run out of means to use up the supply. Get along with means to have a good relationship. When you encounter phrasal verbs with multiple particles, it's best to learn them as a single unit rather than trying to understand each part separately. The meaning often can't be guessed from the individual components. Practice using these phrasal verbs in context to get a feel for how they work in sentences. Part 5. Phrasal verbs in context. Speaking of context, seeing phrasal verbs in complete sentences and real-life situations is one of the best ways to understand and remember them. Listen carefully to these examples. I can't believe she just walked out on her husband like that. Here, walked out on means abandoned. The concert was sold out within minutes. In this case, sold out means all the tickets were sold. He's always showing off his new car. The phrasal verb, showing off, means displaying proudly. They've called off the search for the missing hiker. Here, called off means canceled. As you hear or read English content, try to pay attention to the phrasal verbs being used. Make a note of new ones you encounter and look up their meanings. The more examples you see and hear, the more easily you'll be able to use phrasal verbs correctly in your own English communication. Part 6. Practicing phrasal verbs. Now that we've covered some common phrasal verbs and how they work, let's practice using them. I'll give you a sentence with a phrasal verb, and you try to think of what the phrasal verb means based on the context. 1. I need to put some money aside for a rainy day. In this sentence, put aside means to save. 2. She pointed out the mistake in her essay and corrected it. Here, pointed out means identified. 3. They tore down the old barn and built a new one in its place. The phrasal verb tore down means demolished. 4. He looks after his younger sister while their parents are at work. In this case, looks after means cares for. By practicing with examples like these, you'll start to get a feel for how phrasal verbs work in context. As you go about your day, try to use some of the phrasal verbs you've learned in your own sentences. This will help cement your understanding and make the phrasal verbs a natural part of your English communication. Part 7. Learning phrasal verbs is an ongoing process. There are thousands of them in the English language, and you'll keep encountering new ones as you dive deeper into English. The best way to continue improving your understanding and use of phrasal verbs is to see them in context as much as possible. Read English books, articles, and blog posts. Watch English movies, TV shows, and YouTube videos. Listen to English podcasts and songs. And most importantly, try to use the phrasal verbs you learn in your own speaking and writing. When you come across a new phrasal verb, make a note of it along with the context and meaning. You can create flashcards or use a language learning app to review the phrasal verbs regularly. Don't worry if you make mistakes when using phrasal verbs at first. That's a normal part of the learning process. The more you practice, the more natural and confident you'll become. We started by defining phrasal verbs as combinations of a verb and a preposition or adverb that create a new meaning. We looked at some common phrasal verbs and their various meanings, and we talked about separable and inseparable phrasal verbs, as well as phrasal verbs with multiple particles. We also practiced using phrasal verbs in context and discussed strategies for continuing to learn and practice phrasal verbs on your own. Remember, mastering phrasal verbs takes time and exposure. Be patient with yourself and celebrate your progress along the way.
Verb plus particle, new meaning unfurled. Phrasal verbs are key in the English world. Phrasal verbs, oh, phrasal verbs, they're tricky but cool. Learn them well, use them right, they're a language tool. Some you can separate, others stay tight. With pronouns in between, you'll always be right. Look up, bring down, give in, take off. Context is your friend to know what they mean. Multiple particles can join the fun. Look forward to life when the day is done. Phrasal verbs, oh, phrasal verbs, they're tricky but cool. Learn them well, use them right, they're a language tool. Practice every day, read, watch, and speak. Soon you'll master phrasal verbs, and your English will peak.